Welcome, everybody, to the Better Learning Podcast. This is Mark Barga, and I am here with David Schrader. David, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
David, as a person who's seen it all in design and architecture, do me a favor, just give our audience a little bit of your background. Tell us how you got into not just designing buildings, but designing schools and other buildings for public use and community engagement.
Okay. Well, maybe it goes back all the way. I'm one of those kids who was a little bit of art, but, liked to invent, played with all the toys that actually were put together toys and built all kinds of things because I always wanted to invent. And I think in the end, that's really what architecture is. You're inventing new things each time. Everything's a prototype, everything's a one-off. So it's kind of interesting that you get into that. Found an architecture school that I thought was really good for me, and it did end up being very good, and got out during a very challenging time. It was 1991, challenging time to try to get into the field of architecture. But I was one of the fortunate ones who got a job, and I ended up with a job, of all things, for a firm that did correctional work, because that was a firm that at that time had work to do, whereas many of the others didn't. And so I started with them for a very short time, worked in the office that did the correctional work, found out about an office in the Philadelphia area, which was one of my places of interest to live, and coincidentally at the same time got into University of Pennsylvania for grad school. And that led to living in the area and really developing a life here. But the other part of that is the firm that was here in the Philadelphia area was run by a guy named Ed Kirkbride. And folks who are familiar with at least the Association for Learning Environments, when it was Council of Education Facility Planners, would know Ed because he was a big part of the Northeast region. And then ultimately he had tentacles out to every part of the country as part of A4LE. So he actually grew to be my mentor. Interestingly, I was able to take over his office a short time after he basically finished his career running offices and went off and consulted and was a big part of CEFVI at that time. But he's the reason that I got into academic design. Probably a little bit of family drive as well. My father was in higher education. My mother was a second grade teacher. So I'm sure there's an affinity developed as a result of being, a kid of educators to some extent. So all of those things brought me into the educational design of things, and worked for that company, ran that office for a number of years, and we really developed a great clientele of K-12 work. So I've always called K-12 really academic design. For us, I don't think there's a beginning and an end to academics. And so, yes, there's a span of K-12, but we've done higher ed, we've done pre-K, we've done all kinds of things related to education and the learning environment. So those are all really critical to me. We were very fortunate in that as we worked through that, we ended up with a series of clients in this region who weren't necessarily just thinking about, and you certainly know the term, the old cells and bells or egg crate, design. They were thinking more about how academics are perceived and how they might be approached in the next generation. And so I just happened to be fortunate enough to work with a couple at the beginning who were thinking differently about how you approach education and how the facility or how the environment itself is structured around it, and did a couple of projects like that. And slowly we began to have some notoriety in trying to really tie the academic end with whatever the facility or environment end was. And so we've been able to work through some pretty transformative concepts over time. Probably, though, the bigger driver and the thing that really gave us a vocabulary to work from was certainly a really heavy involvement with Association for Learning Environments. So that has been the stimulus behind and kind of the vocabulary setter for all of the different approaches to design and planning that we didn't previously know about. So that's been the stimulus. That's how I got into academic design, and why at least the office that we have around us here is built around that.
fascinating. And of course, it's impossible not to notice the juxtaposition of starting with, correctional facilities, and ending with students at the center of, your design mind. I mean, that's a fascinating.
I'll tell you one more story about that because you bring that up. I right after college, I went across the country with a couple fraternity brothers. We did that drive across the country, and I knew about the job that I was getting, and believe me, I was very grateful to have a job, but I didn't get excited about designing correctional facilities. And my buddy was a structural engineer from the Penn State architectural engineering program. And as we're in San Francisco, he gets a call that he's also got a job now. And so he's all excited about his job. Told me his salary, which was quite a bit more than the architectural salary, but that's another story. And we go to get on the boat to go across to Alcatraz. And I'm walking around Alcatraz with my shoulders dipping in my, thought process going downhill because I realize how frustrated I am. And I let them know, my fraternity brothers, how frustrated I was that correctional design or designing something for people to not like was what I was going to do. So really fortunate, within a year or two to be able to move into something that people celebrate when they get to walk around a really great facility.
Yeah. And where the intent is really to help humans flourish, and that's the kind of work that you do. I mean, I'm curious, you use the word transformational, right? With some of the school partnerships that you've developed over the years and many of the projects that you've done. What are some of what you would describe as maybe key indicators that a district or a prospective client they're ready for a building to be more than just a new building? They want to use it as a catalyst for a change in trajectory, right? To reshape their narrative, to expand what's possible. What are some of the things that come to mind when you start those conversations or when you've started those projects that make those different?
Yeah. Well, I think two things really come to mind when I think about how the clients who are differentiated from that perspective approach these things. One certainly is they start by talking about the learner and the learning process. So it's not a discussion initially about, I'm going to build a school for X dollars in an XYZ timeframe. That's critically important to these projects for sure. But when they do start the conversation with the learner and the learning process, and they really kind of articulate a vision for the future, that's when you know that you are hooked into something very interesting. So that's number one. And number two for us, I think, is hearing that there is an interest in involving others, whether it be community, the academic community itself, getting down to teachers and learners and all of those folks. When we hear that those folks are going to be involved in the process, I think then you really know you've got something that could lead to a transformative project for sure.
And those folks select you, for example, to sort of be their guide, right? And you establish a partnership with them and you guys go on the journey together. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about what this type of deep, robust partnership between district and designer really looks like. What does a great partnership look like to you?
Yeah, well, that was actually well put, the way you just structured that question. So, and by the way, that's not us only. Hopefully it's anybody who's doing the kind of things that we do, the project types that we do. I hope that's, and I see, certainly. I mean, all of our colleagues are very good at this. So this doesn't fall on us alone. I think it does go back to when you do see them engaging with community and the community is going to be part of the process, that's just a giant part of this whole thing. When they tell you that it's almost like a welcome to the team, then you know you're into a situation where you've got a true partnership going. We always try to, sometimes we don't have to interview for a project. And in those cases, that's a wonderful experience because they are reaching out for you and your team, which is important. In those cases, you already know that you're stepping aboard something that's going to be a great cruise ship that hopefully will lead to a great solution. But when you are interviewing, we do try to turn the questions around a little bit and try to really poke at the owner to see if we're going to find that they're partners as well, and they're interested in a true partnership. Like you said, these partnerships are, sometimes in our state, you have to develop a feasibility study before it even leads to whatever the master planning is for the district, which then finally will lead to the various projects that you do. And many times you're brought aboard for that. And when you're involved from study on, I have a client that we started with back in, it must be 2007. So it's been ongoing projects with that particular client since then. And that's a journey. So maybe one project takes 5 years, but think about, that's 19 years worth of projects for a client. So that's a true partnership.
There's a lot of nuance and a lot of depth and a lot of all of the contours of those districts, the community dynamics, the politics, the vision of political leadership. You really establish a sophisticated understanding of a client relationship over time. And so certainly that's reflected in the work. That makes sense.
Well, that's giving us a little more credit than it's probably due. But it is true that especially when you're engaged for quite a while, you may go through multiple iterations of a board. You might go through multiple iterations of a administration. And so we do try very hard to learn what it is that is the basis of that community, so that hopefully whatever we're building becomes central to that community, because that's what these buildings are.
So you've spent 3 decades in architecture, right? But you've drawn your inspiration from many places, right? You've drawn your inspiration from across many domains of design and architecture, conversations and experiences that you've accumulated in your travels. What can K-12 education, or academic education, as you may say, or academic design rather, pardon me, what can they learn from other sectors that are also doing meaningful, creative, imaginative work?
Yeah, take it from any angle. I think let's talk about learning for a second. If you really think about learning styles and the spaces that you build around them, those strangely and uniquely, because the money is there, begin in industry, right? And so if you watch how some of the really thoughtful companies are building the environments around the kinds of workflow, the kinds of creative processes that they want, and I won't name any of the companies, but you can all pick them. Those work environments are all very dynamic, very unique, very flexible and adaptable. And they're built with the latest thought process in mind. And if you really follow that line and hit higher education, you'll see the think tanks in higher education start with that. It drips right down into the traditional collegiate spaces for some of those areas, those universities and higher education institutions, and then certainly into the amenity spaces and all of those. And by the way, that's what higher ed is building for. They're building the amenities to attract the students to eventually be attracted to the industry that will have the same kinds of things if they're lucky enough. We kind of watch that drip down into secondary education, and strangely for probably you and me, we want to actually see that start in primary and pre-K, because ultimately that has to lift with the learner as the learner goes through their learning process. I think kind of a collateral, because you brought it up, is civic and community type work. If you really look at the well-established civic and community spaces, that is a great connection of indoor-outdoor. Those of us who like any kind of civic space really appreciate most a great outdoor space leading to a really thoughtful and connected indoor space. And those are the kinds of things, whether it's a museum, let's look at our nation's capital and some of those great facilities. Look at any great historic town where you've got a town green and then you've got all of the collection of spaces around it. That's a school. That literally is what a school is, the town green with all of the spaces around it, all in one. So you can kind of draw from that from the side, and you put all these pieces together and think about it a little bit with probably some of the unique approaches that we've been seeing both internationally. I like to look at the Pacific Northwest. I think they're still leading the way to some extent in a lot of this, and especially through A4LE, it's been really great to be able to follow what's going on in those regions. But all of those people are thinking about both how industry feeds down to higher ed, feeds down to PK-12. And I think the really thoughtful ones are thinking about how the learning environment draws from these great civic spaces that we see as well. So always keeping in mind the environment and how important it is for the learner to be attached to the environment.
You mentioned the word flexibility, right? Which is, of course, a buzzword, right? And we hear this all the time in school design, right? We want flexible, we want flexibility, we want adaptable, right? If you don't mind, share a little bit more about some of the trends that you've seen in your time designing, academic spaces. What are some of the developments or the shifts that you've seen over time that really actually excite you, that kind of reaffirm, your sense that, the design community really is aligning with better outcomes for kids?
I erased the first 15 or 20 years because I don't think that at least the region that I have grown up in designing was tremendously forward thinking at that time. The last 20 years, I feel much better about, and I think that the folks that I see doing what we do in our region are really doing some beautiful, incredible things. So let's talk about physical environment for a second. So I think one of the great approaches right now, and that I think will be really terrific for the future, certainly is people thinking about these buildings as warehouses that you're building temporary enclosures in for the meantime. And I hate to differentiate from the external environment and the internal, because we really want those to feed one another in a really good academic institution. But when you're building a relatively simple structural bay that you can modify drywall and walls within to change the configuration of a space within a reasonable amount of time, that's the flexibility that we're looking for in the future. If you think about the buildings that were built in the 50s and 60s that were tearing down, many masonry bearing structures, things that are very difficult to adapt and adopt, all of those terrific glazed block colors that everybody hates now, that are not flexible and adaptable. And so you're stuck with these corridors. So when you build today, you're trying to think about that flexibility in the future construction and adaptability of the project. Second thing that's huge today, and is another item that in the last 20 years has developed itself significantly, is furniture. So between those two pieces, those two allow you to create the most flexible and adaptable spaces that were not available in the past. If you think about the furniture that we were building around the same thing for 100 years, if not more. That was a really constraining element for educators to try to work through. So those are some trends that I think, and I don't like to use the word trends, but those are items that I think are going to help us quite a bit with being able to be adaptable and flexible in the future. Other things that I'm seeing that give me great hope, when people started to think certainly about different educational pedagogies, that's important. But even more when people started tying things like brain research and cognitive thought process and all of those pieces to space, and to understand that we are all different, we all learn differently, not only adapting different sizes and types of spaces or environments or external spaces or whatever, but started to really think about that and how the learner is really an individual with all of those different comprehensive needs. And when people started talking about that, it gave me great hope, certainly. And I'm not a researcher, but I certainly want to see the research. And so that's been a big part. And if you follow, and you certainly do, and certainly people who are listening to this, A4LE, for instance, and most of the other groups who are following what A4LE does, have been focusing on that in the last 5 or 10 years. And we know that that's the next step. We just have to understand. I think we're in a time of experimentation for learning environments for the moment. And I think a little bit more time melding the research, which is underway, and the end result, I think, is going to result in some terrific spaces. Already has. It just needs even more development.
When we work with schools at K-12, it's not just about furniture design. It's about impact. Our radically student-centered approach puts students at the center of every decision. From that first conversation to the final walkthrough, we're focused on creating spaces that actually work for the kids, the teachers, and the community. So if you're looking to do more than just check a box on your next project, let's talk. Visit K12.com. That's KAY-TWELVE.com and see how we're helping schools transform learning one student at a time. Because at K-12, it's not just about projects and furniture, it's about purpose.
There's so many tensions in between the reality of educational practice and institutional life, right? On the school side, the emergent research that we know about physiology, about social connection, about acoustics and light and all the things you were referring to and alluding to, and ergonomic design and movement. So it does sometimes feel like sometimes the educators and architects may not speak the same language, right? I mean, how do you work to kind of bridge that gap as far as, creating some common understanding and, as you said, sort of language and framework to think about establishing goals?
I guess you do have to go back to some of the researchers. You have to go back to some of the things that we're seeing through the organizations that we're all part of. Those are certainly setting some context for us all to work within. Like we wouldn't know some of this if we weren't going and seeing going to these conferences and hearing some of these great presentations. For sure, we wouldn't know anything about this. Every inventor is a result of all the inventors before them, right? And so the best that you can do is to try to adapt and adopt from all those great things you hear. So that's really important. How to link the educator, I think quite often we really have to rely on very thoughtful administrators who maybe have seen the light and know that there's another step that could be taken. I sometimes feel that the educators, and you see the ones that are just amazing and have a whole nother thought process versus the ones who are going to go to work. It's probably just like us in the design field, but are going to go to work and do what they have to do to educate the student and then maybe do something similar the next year and the next year. The ones who are very, very creative and the administrators who support those folks are the ones that we're all going to latch on to. And they may or may not be right with what they're doing, but if they see results and if we see results, then they are right. So those are the ones that we like to connect with.
Well, passion is passion is infectious, right? And the educators you're describing, I always think about them as early adopters. These are folks who are on board with design. They want transformation, right? So you think about a faculty group. I think about it as you have your 20% maybe who are just on fire for teaching. I mean, they're on fire for it, right? Then you have maybe your 20% at the other end of the spectrum, and maybe it's less than that. Let's say maybe it's 10% who are just, they're not going to change, right? And they're going to be high friction people, right? In the process of growth and development and moving into something new. But I really think that middle constituency of educators are working hard. They need great leadership. They need support, and they need affirmation that it's okay to experiment and make mistakes and try new things. And those are folks you can reach. And that's how districts really build, I think, a robust culture around new types of teaching, in my experience. So I think it's absolutely on point.
That's huge, Mark. And I think, that thank you for saying 10%, and hopefully it's less. You can't be an educator, I don't think, without having a passion for what the next generation is going to do. I truly believe that. Again, second grade teacher mother, she was always talking about the kids. They were really important to her. To this day, she still talks about her teaching days. So I think that's really special.
And maybe it's worth noting that even in that 10%, it doesn't mean ineffective educator. It just means someone who's unwilling to change, right? And so you could even have strong practitioners who are really experienced. I mean, I've worked in schools for 15 years, and you might find educators who are they are executing. They're just not going to grow, So maybe that's a distinction worth making.
Yeah, that is worth it. And by no means am I trying to cast any kind of negativity on that. It's when you're trying to figure out, when we're all experimenting and trying to figure out what 21st century learning, that's the wrong term even. Next generation learning is going to be. we're looking for the ones who are progressive. And like anything else, we're probably not looking for the bleeding edge. We're looking for the cutting edge. If we see that they're successful and the students are just totally invigorated, holy cow, that's what we want to get. So that's what we work towards. From a process standpoint, I think we're doing something similar, hopefully, to what our colleagues do. And that is we really like to work through the workshop process. Have a couple great ones going on now that are continued month after month with those kinds of educators that we just spoke about. And those people have this passion to build these ed specs and build these thought processes. And they are thinking about, in this case, it's middle school that I'm thinking about. They have all kinds of ideas. And it's almost, at this point in time, it's almost like, okay, now where do we stop? Like, and what is it that we don't do as part of this educational environment? So those are the moments when you're just totally thrilled and you know that you've started to connect with a broader spectrum of people and you can really work with them to come up with something unique.
It's a good problem to have to rein folks in a little bit because we still have the pragmatic realities of running a building and the logistics that are necessary. But the fact that you're creating those opportunities with schools and giving teachers permission to dream, I think that's what this is about. And that I think is a hallmark of a great process. So actually, to that point there, picture one of your projects, right? We walk into a building 20 years from now, right? You're looking around, we walk through with the superintendent or the principal. What are you going to look for that are going to be the indicators for you that, you know what, this was a design process well executed. This is the right way to design. What are you looking for when you go into a building?
Well, anybody would look for timelessness, right? So that's, if you're looking for a facility side of things, that certainly is what is going to be very much appreciated. But I would say that the first day that we walk in a building, the first day, not talking about 20 years from now like you're asking about, when you walk in that first day and they open the doors and the kids are just walking in awe and they are excited and there's all kinds of energy and the faculty is full of energy and everybody's just excited about the new spaces. And I'm not talking about the new car smells. That's not the part that we're talking about. Talking about like the awe of space and how I use it and how exciting that's going to be. And it's not the same old, same old. So you hope that translates over all of the years. So that's going to be something that we hope you hear 20 years into the game too. I do like going back after 10 years and seeing the buildings just filled with art and excitement and student athletes and music around you and all of those great things and just seeing the passion and connection that the kids have with the faculty. That's a good indicator that things are really going well if you see a lot of that for sure. So that's important. I did think of a couple of things. Certainly I mentioned that you would want 20 years from then, the planning to be timeless, hopefully as much as possible. The design is timeless. We were just having this conversation with a superintendent yesterday. His memory of different eras of buildings that he's either worked in or been part of designing as a superintendent. He certainly remembers the time that I remember going to school in the institutional buildings with the puke green glazed tile hallways. Maybe that term's not the appropriate term, but that's, you know what it is. Everybody remembers these hallways. He also remembers the split-face block buildings and the green and blue standing seam roofs because he was part of the design of that era. And he remembers a couple of other eras where you can pinpoint that time that building was built. We don't want that. We want these things as much as possible to be timeless. You brought up both the flexibility and adaptability, which is critical, but to continue the ease, durability, we want these things to hold up so that they don't look like they've been beat up after 20 years. So that's really critical to us, that they're built well, they feel like good machines that people can really experiment within. Finishes and aesthetics, just like I mentioned a second ago, you don't want them tying you into an era for sure. So we want that to be something that can be adapted and adopted over time. And 20 years from now, if that building still looks like it's the community center, then I think you've been successful. So that is really ultimately what we want.
you've talked about this in other places, and it's been said, that as you've worked across many domains of civic life, right? Your firm has designed community centers, police stations. I mean, everything related to community and civic life. There's a sort of responsibility that comes with that. There's a sort of responsibility to approach work that is really for the public good. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how does that inform your thinking?
I will say it's not a burden. We're very grateful to be part of all of those projects, for sure, the ones that we are. You're responsible, so back away from all of the great academic thought processes we've been talking about, and think about the fact that you're a shepherd of the taxpayer's dollar. And so the responsibility that you have is actually pretty great. And whatever you're putting out there has to be something that is appreciated and recognized by the community, is not thought to be over the top or ostentatious, but definitely represents a great investment of the community's money. So it could be called a burden. It's not a burden because we're so grateful to be able to do it. I think it's something that you definitely have to have some confidence to be able to do, because you're putting things out there in the community that are going to be out there for 50 years, for sure.
It's different than a mall. It's different than a commercial development. It's different than even a residential development somewhere. I mean, the work that you guys have done, I think it can help form and shape different aspects of community life.
Yeah, I'm not sure I think about it enough, and how much I appreciate the fact that we can do that. It's great because I think as a designer or planner, you're always looking at what your colleagues are doing because you're so appreciative of the really good designers and good planners. And so I will look at a terrific project by somebody else who's designed or built something and be able to really appreciate all of the money, time, energy, community support that went into that building, and feel really good about it and be really excited about it. So I think amongst our entire team, we certainly try to instill in people regularly, like you guys realize the incredible opportunity that you have to be building within your communities, and what a great opportunity that is for you as a designer and planner. We try to do that somewhat regularly. We also try to highlight, every couple of weeks, we'll highlight projects that maybe not everybody in the studios know about, and really put that out there with them so that they can feel the same pride. It's an amazing thing. We also have every year at the holiday party, and it might actually be driven just maybe there's a tiny bit of imbibement involved at the holiday party, but you're also celebrating what happened that year and all these great projects. And it's really great because the significant others who are attending this thing also get to see. And I've heard comments afterwards, wow, I didn't know what so-and-so was doing as part of this. I have even more pride in what they do when they go to work every day. So I guess maybe that's a roundabout way to express the gratitude that we have for being able to do these kinds of projects.
So you've referenced some of the other great people you've worked with in the course of your career throughout our conversation here. I'm wondering if you might just say a little bit about the sources of inspiration and connection and strength and insight that you've accumulated in your time, both in A4LE and beyond, just as an architect and as someone who's led a company.
The journey of continual learning for me, honestly, has been the Association for Learning Environments and everything that goes along with that, because that obviously has all sorts of spin-offs. But this goes back one more time to Ed Kirkbride. So Ed was kind of the center of trying to bring our region of CEFBI at that time back together. He had a group of colleagues that he was close to, and they brought a couple of us who were much younger in, and realized that if they hooked us, that we could be the next generation of this and start to build it. And I was so lucky at that time because I got in the middle of this great group of people from the whole Northeast. And not only were we so interested in CEFBI at that time and building all the things that were going on with our region, but we were buddies. And they're all great planners and designers and folks in the industry from this whole region, and we just had a great time. So that led us, because we would then go to the national conferences, and I think we took away at that time more than we provided, quite honestly. I think we saw so much going on across the industry that I really feel was not happening in our region. And with that, plus kind of a growing thought process in the Northeast region, a little bit more progressive thought process that was out there, but the buildings had not yet followed, or the learning environments had not yet followed, was the timing was just right. We were all able to start to speak the language and do things that we were seeing being done. And again, I go back to the Pacific Northwest and some of the great things that people were doing there, and start to bring that into the region. Fast forward a little bit, that same group of people evolved through the leadership of Northeast region. And I was fortunate enough to end up at the international level on the board, and then eventually was able to be chair of the organization. And through that board involvement, I went everywhere and saw more than I think most people are able to see related to learning environments in places like Singapore. Who would go to Singapore to look at the learning environments from where I live? I mean, it's just not an opportunity that many people have. Europe, again, throughout Canada and Pacific Northwest. And it just gave you this vocabulary, both of architectural context to work within, but it also gave you a really good sense of how learning was changing in these places as well. So that gave us a true instigation to do some of the things that we've done in the region. And I know the colleagues from A4LE have done the same thing. And together, this whole group has really brought the Northeast along in a really great way. So I'm psyched to be part of it, to be honest.
And you're proud to represent your architectural circles from the greater Pennsylvania area, which is exciting. So to bring it to a close, if I may, you've grown this company, right, for decades, and it's changed in many ways. I'm sure you could talk all day about the different iterations and the different starts and stops and the ways that it has evolved over time. But how have you protected the integrity and the values that guide your process? As new folks come, folks go, people pass through, and processes change and the org chart changes. There's a core there for you. How have you kept everybody true to that mission?
And I hope it is true to that mission. I hope it looks that way from the outside too. Again, I'm super grateful for the background that I had, the opportunity that I had to grow as quickly as I did in the firm that I worked for. And the one thing that I think that I saw as I made a decision to not be part of that organization anymore was it was slowly sliding towards making sure that everything was profitable, and by the way, that's how business works. So let's not push that one aside for even a second. But it was flipping away from really a client-centric approach. And so when I started this Schrader Group, it was really focused on making sure that the client, the learner, the community was the first focus. And yes, we needed to make money to stay in business. That's very important, and to continue to attract really good people. But you really had to focus, as that was the initial premise, was really to focus on the people and the community. And I think that really worked. Back to some of your initial questions, that's what allowed us to always create partnerships. I'm confident that our clients think that we are partners, and we certainly feel that way about them. Back to your point, we get into a school district and we are totally engulfed and ingrained in that community. We are a part of that. We're there at every board meeting. We're there presenting for everything. We're conducting workshops with everybody. And so that's the process that you referenced in your question. How do you maintain that? Probably most through principal level involvement. So anybody that is working, and I would say everybody works around me and around us as the principals. Everybody's doing the same level of quality, whether you're doing it in the office or whether you're doing it in front of the client. So I think the principal level involvement certainly keeps us there. And I do think that the people that come here mostly because they see that and are excited about that and know that it leads to the kinds of projects that we do. So at least for the moment, that's the way that it's evolved and stayed in that level of evolution. Our recent move, which was to become part of Cord Coplan Macht, was really intentional, particularly because we're the same types of work in the PK-12. They call theirs PK-12. We are called Pennsylvania Education as part of that. I saw the same thought process in the K-12 group and people that are very, very similar and a culture that has the same thought processes about the client. And so that is a natural evolution for us. It's providing a framework for us to hopefully be even better and provide more to those same clients. And it's definitely proving itself. So to this point in time, those are all the reasons that we've done what we've done and why we've stayed the way we've stayed.
Closing question. For folks in our audience who are about ready to begin the school construction journey, they're just thinking, maybe it's time to do that addition, or maybe they're just getting their feet in the water. They've begun. What parting words of advice might you offer those folks, whether they be on the district side or the design firm side? What final thoughts might you offer them?
Yeah. Get exposure through groups like A4LE or any of the types of groups that A4LE represents for sure. And as you get into this, I'm going to go back to a word that you've used several times. Make sure that you create a partnership that is true to your end result. That is a really important part of this whole process.
Well, David Schrader, I cannot thank you enough for making the time to sit down. It's been an absolute pleasure having you.
Well, thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
The Better Learning Podcast is produced by Matt Rogers and edited by Kelly Jones. The views and opinions shared on this podcast are those of the individual speaking and do not necessarily represent the perspectives of their affiliated companies, organizations, or associations.